Today we're going to be learning Yoma Daf Samach. Today's daf, actually a week of learning, is sponsored by Sivya and Nachum Tursky in honor of Shoshana Baker's milestone birthday. May Hashem grant her arichut yamim in good health with her beautiful family. There is so much nachat left to come. We are so very proud of her commitment to Torah, Avodah, and Gmilut Chasadim, Hamivin Yavin. All are love and admiration, Mom and Abba. And for another dedication to Shoshana, today's daf is sponsored by Mark Baker in honor of his wife's birthday, Shoshana, wishing her the happiest birthday to his beautiful wife. And by Gita Jaroslawis Neufeld for the refuah shlema of David Ben Idol and all that need health. Refuah shlema. We're going to start our daf from the very end of yesterday's daf. If you remember, in Nun Ted Amud Bet, that very, very short Amud, there was a discussion about Me'ilah by the blood and how there's no laws of Me'ilah by the blood. And it gave on a D'oraita level, and the whole discussion of whether there's Me'ilah after we spilled the water into Nachal Kidron, we spilled the blood into Nachal Kidron, that's only on a rabbinic level. To which the Gemara said, in general, there's no Me'ilah by blood. And how do we know that? And they gave three different drashot, all from the same verse, from either the word lachem, I gave blood to you, lachem, and not to any, not meaning lachem belongs to you, like anything, meaning the blood is yours, God says. Or meaning there's no, again, what is Me'ilah? Misuse of consecrated property. Consecrated property means it belongs to God. This is all for you. Number two, lechaper, the purpose of it is for atoning, not for having laws of Me'ilah and being kind of in this other category. The third is who. Who means it's always the same, both before and after atonement. Now, after atonement, of course, there's no laws of Me'ilah, the Gemara assumes, because the mitzvah was already done. Once you fulfill the mitzvah, there's no longer a din of Me'ilah in general. And that's just a general principle. Now, that's the principle the Gemara is going to question right now. Is that really true? And then we said, well, then the drasha was, the status is always the same. And since after atonement, it clearly doesn't have a law of Me'ilah, then of course, before atonement, it won't have laws of Me'ilah. Now the Gemara says, right, and that's because ein lecha davar, on the second to last line in yesterday's daf, ein lecha davar shenaseh mitzvato u'mo'alim bo. There is no such thing that you actually finish a mitzvah and you still have laws of Me'ilah. Me'ilah is only until the mitzvah is finished. That's why it's kind of in God's territory. It's belonging to him because you haven't done the mitzvah yet. Once the mitzvah is done, the whole sanctity kind of is removed. To which the Gemara says below, are you really sure? I'm going to show you an example where the mitzvah is finished, and yet there's still laws of Me'ilah. V'harei truma kadeshen. I've actually seen this entire sugya before. It sounds familiar. Trumat hadeshen. Okay, what's trumat hadeshen? Remember, you take the ashes from the maracha. You take a small amount of them every morning. It's the first avodah the Kohen does. He takes and he puts it next to the altar, next to the ramp of the altar on the eastern side. There's a little pile. Now it says in the Torah, you can look at the psukim on the sheet, in Vayikra, Perek Vav. It says, I'm skipping to the end of the pasuk, V'herim et hadeshen asher tochal eshet ha'olah al mizbeach. You pick up the deshen, v'samo et al mizbeach, and you place it next to the mizbeach. When you place it, the idea is v'samo. First of all, it doesn't even say v'sam, it says v'samo. It should be placed. And that means it has to stay there. You can't use it for any purpose. It still has laws of Me'ilah, even though you've already finished the mitzvah. The mitzvah is to take the ashes off and put them down in the pile. You would say once they're in the pile, the mitzvah's done, no Me'ilah anymore, but it does have. So what's the answer? How do we respond? Well, mishum dehave trumat hadeshen ubigdei kuhuna shnei ktuvim habeim ke'echad. V'chol shnei ktuvim habeim ke'echad ein melamdim. This is a general principle. If you have, let's start with one. You have one something that appears once in the Torah. We assume that creates what we call a binyan av. We call it a paradigm. You can learn from there to all other cases. So if it just said it by Trumat HaDeshen, that it has a mitzvah, yeah, it has Me'ilah even after its mitzvah is done, you would assume we could learn from here to all other cases. And then we're really in a problem. But if you say we have two cases where this is true, the other is the Kohen Gadol's clothing on Yom Kippur, which have to be buried and can never be used anymore. I know you're thinking, maybe you remember this. There's a whole machloket about that. We're going to get to that. But right now, we're going to assume that we're holding by one opinion, which is the Kohen Gadol's clothing that he used on Yom Kippur. We're talking about the Bigdei Lavan, the ones that are either identical to what a Kohen Hedyot wears, or remember, maybe there's a difference with the belt, maybe they're not exactly identical, and that affects this whole machloket really. If you say they're not identical, then there's nothing you could do with them, and then they're left in Geniza forever. They can never be used. Another Kohen Gadol is not allowed to use them next year. We're going to see in a minute where they learn that from the verse. But right now, they just assume you know that. So let's assume you know that. We have two instances where, even though the mitzvah was done, he used the Kohen Gadol clothes that year on Yom Kippur, and the mitzvah is finished, they still have a law of Me'ilah. They need Geniza. Anything that needs Geniza means it has to be put away, and no one can ever use it. You can't benefit from them. So therefore, once we have two exceptions to the rule, right? And if you have one, it's the rule. Once you have two, we assume the Torah had to repeat it. Why? Because it's only in these two cases and not in any other case. Now, there's a whole debate about that also. Some people say twice still creates a paradigm for everything else. Only 3 times doesn't. We'll get to that soon. But right now, let's assume that we're holding, number one, that the Kohen Gadol's clothes need Geniza. They can't be used again. And number two, that if something's mentioned twice, you can't learn from here to anything else. So they say now we're going to start getting complicated. Well, this only works if you hold that the Kohen Gadol's clothes need Geniza, but not if you hold the other opinion. So let's read that inside. This all works for the rabbis. Here's the verse. It says, okay, we can look at the verse inside. Again, I brought it on the sheet. Vayikra tet zayin, pasuk kaf gimel. Uba Aharon al Ol Moed. He finishes, he comes to Ol Moed. Pashatit bigdei avad asher lavash. He takes off the white clothing he was wearing, the linen clothes. B'vo'ol HaKodesh, that he wore when he went into Kodesh Kodeshim. V'hinicham sham, and he places them there. Sounds very similar to V'samo etzel hamizbeach, right? It's placed there, meaning it's going to stay there. Hinicham sham, it's going to stay there. So, according to the rabbis, hinicham sham melamed shetunim geniza. According to their opinion, it means that you need Geniza, and therefore they fit into the same category. And then we have Shnei Ktuvim, and Shnei Ktuvim don't teach to anywhere else. And then we just say, fine, we have our rule, and these are the exceptions to the rule. But Rabbi Dosa, Da'amal, Bigdei Kuna, Ru'uyin the Kohen Hedyot. But if you hold like Rabbi Dosa, who says that the Kohen Gadol's clothing on Yom Kippur, since now you'd have to, Rabbi Dosa would have to say they're identical. He does wear the same belt as the Kohen Hedyot. And the Bigdei Kuna on Yom Kippur, the white linen clothing, are identical 100% to what a Kohen Hedyot normally wears. And not only that, but the Kohen Hedyot can use them. There's no need for Geniza. There's no Me'ilah. Why? Because Naseh Mitzvata, exactly our reason. Well, if you hold that, now we're stuck because we're back to one verse teaches you that and no more, in which case it should create a paradigm. We should learn from Trumat Hadeshin to everything else. And that basically goes against what we just said, which is anything Shanaseh Mitzvato in Mo'alimbo. So Ma'i Kalamemer, what can we say? Easy. We'll find another case. There's a third case. Mishum dehave Trumat Hadeshin ve'egla arufa, shnei ktuvim aba'im ke'echad, v'chol shnei ktuvim aba'im ke'echad em alamdim. Egla arufa is when someone dies in between two cities. We're not in any city and we don't know who killed the person. Someone is murdered. So we measure to the two closest cities. We figure out which city is closer. We say that city has to do a ceremony of Egla Rufa. They have to break the neck of a heifer. And what do we say? It says in the verse there, if you look inside, Dvarim Perek Kaf Aleph Pasuk Dalid, Horidu Ziknei Hier Et Egla El Nachal Eitan. They bring it to a Nachal. Asher lo yavebo v'lo yizara, lo yizarea, v'arfu sham et egla banachal. Notice what word appears here again? Sham. They break the neck of the egla there. What did they darshan from this? Sham means it has to stay there, meaning it doesn't really have to stay there, but you can't use that egla for anything. You can't benefit from it. Okay, you can't sell it. You can't, right, use the hide, nothing. Dead. Okay, dead and buried. So what do you learn here? We have, now that's a case where Naseh Mitzvato, the mitzvah is Egla Rufa, you finished your mitzvah, and yet it's still forbidden to use. So now we have two examples of a case where the mitzvah is done, and yet it's forbidden to benefit from. So that's perfect. We have, so we don't care that there was a machloket about Bigdei Kuna. We found a different case, and therefore it's clear. However, as I said before, there's a machloket about this whole issue of Shnei Ktuvim. So hani chalaman damar emalamdim. That's if you hold the 2 times something's mentioned twice, it means we can't learn from here to anything else. And they're just exceptions to the rule. But to those who say the 2 cases still creates a paradigm, then we're really stuck. What can you say? So now we have to try some other option because we don't have 3 ktuvim. I mean, you could say again, we have big day kuna if you hold by that opinion, but it's not going to help us if we hold by Rabbi Dosa, who thinks that they're not forbidden to benefit from. So they give a different answer. Both by the Truma Radeshin and by the Egla Rufa, there's a unique use of a word, which makes it very clear that it's just in this case and nothing else. So what are the words? Vissamo, as I told you before, it could have just simply said, Vissam, it's on the Mizbeach, and you put it by the Mizbeach. Samo, you put it, it's like adding that extra it, even though we know what it was. You didn't need to say it. We know you're talking about the ashes. We just said that. So that comes to say just here, nowhere else. And ha'arufa, okay, later it says, Yurchatsu yidehem al ha'eglah ha'arufa banachal. Okay, everyone who's involved washes their hands by the eglah arufa banachal. But it could have just said the eglah arufa. Why does it say eglah ha'arufa, which is he'a yidiyah, that means the arufa, the one whose neck was broken. That comes to say this one is different from everything else, not to distinguish it from other eglot, other animals, but to distinguish it from others about this law, about the fact that it's forbidden to benefit from is only the arufa and not any other case. So there we have how these 2 are exceptions to the rule, and they don't break our rule, that our rule really does stand, which explains the blood, which is once the mitzvah is done, there's no longer any sanctity to it in terms of laws of me'ilah. Okay, then we had said, again, they instituted that on a rabbinic level, it will have me'ilah, but certainly not on a doraita level. Now they go back to those 3 drashot that we started with yesterday. So we had 3 drashot to teach you that there's no law of me'ilah by the blood. Now they say, it seems a little strange, we should have 3 psukim to teach us the same thing. And it's 3 words in the same verse. So why do you need all those? Lachem, it's yours. Lechaper, for yourself. Who, the status is always the same. Can't all be from me'ilah. So they say, it's to say that the following 3 laws, which normally apply to meat of a sacrifice, do not apply to blood of a sacrifice. We've talked about this before, the comparison between the meat from the sacrifice and the blood from the sacrifice. There's certain things that are only true for the meat and are not true for the blood. What are those? Laws of notar, that if it's left beyond its designated time, right, it has to be burned. And if you eat it, you get karet. So that's not true for the blood. Me'ilah, which we've already explained. And tuma, that if, let's say, you're tameh and you eat it, or you're tameh and you handle it, then you're going to get karet. Here with the blood, that's just not true. Okay, so those 3 psukim come to exclude those things. Now, whenever we see notav and tuma, it always goes, there's a threesome, and it's not usually with me'ilah. Here, there's a threesome, it's with me'ilah. But usually it's pigul, notav, and tameh. And notar and pigul almost always go together. So now they're going to ask, right? They're not actually questioning it, but they're saying, if you're going to ask me, why isn't there a verse to exclude laws of pigul? Now, what's pigul? Pigul is when I have intent, the Kohen has intent while he's doing the sacrifice, but let's say while he's slaughtering, he thinks, I'm going to eat the meat beyond the designated time or outside the designated place where I'm allowed to eat it, right? One is karet, one isn't karet, but either which way, that's what's called pigul. So if he has the wrong intent, he thinks I'm going to eat it tomorrow and it has to be eaten today or whatever it might be. Usually you have 2 days, but let's say I'm going to eat it in 2 days, or you have 1 day, eat it, in the wrong day, or I'm going to burn it on the altar tomorrow, which has to be burnt on the altar today. Then that has laws of pigul associated with it, but the blood does not have pigul associated. And yes, we're talking about blood. This is a general verse about blood. We're talking about blood from any sacrifice, okay? All sacrificial blood are not subject to laws of pigul. Now, why wouldn't you need another something in the verse to exclude that? Now, they take it for granted. They know that there's no laws of pigul when it comes to the blood. The question is why, and why don't we have a drasha for it? So they say you don't need a drasha from a pasuk because it's obvious why. Because pigul has certain laws about it, where pigul applies and where it doesn't. And obviously doesn't apply by blood, and this is going to be why. Ditnan, it says in the Mishnah in Zvachim, Kol sheyesh lo mitirim, ben la'adam ben lemizbeach, chayavim alav mishum pigul. What are you obligated pigul for? If it has mitirim. Okay, what does that mean? That means it allows something else. Okay, so it is permitted by something else. I said it exactly wrong. Yesh lo mitirim means by doing some other act, you are permitted to do something else. So for example, if you sprinkle the blood on the altar, after you sprinkle the blood, you now are allowed to burn the meat on the altar, or you're allowed to eat the meat, right? Certain meat is permitted at that point. So the eating the meat or burning it on the altar is permitted by its mutal, it's mitirim, by the sprinkling of the blood. So that means that the blood, I'll read the next words, dam atzmo matir. The blood itself is the matir. It's what permits something else. Because it says, as soon as you finish getting kapara, your atonement, then you burn the parts on the altar. So if you don't, like for example, let's say you didn't sprinkle the blood, can you burn the parts on the altar? Can you eat the meat? Absolutely not. You must sprinkle the blood before you burn the parts that are supposed to be burnt on the altar and before you eat the meat. That means that pigul applies to the meat because the meat is something that is permitted by something else. Whereas blood, sprinkling of the blood is not permitted by anything else. There's nothing you have to do. I mean, you do have to slaughter the animal, but that's just a technicality. If you don't slaughter the animal, you won't have blood. Okay, but that's not something that has mitirim. It's not like it says you have to do the act of shchita. If you didn't do the act of shchita, you can't sprinkle the blood. Again, it's true you can't, but it's not something that halachically matirs the blood. So the blood is not permitted by anything. It itself is a permitter. It permits something else. It allows you to be able to eat the meat. Okay, I'll give you another example because it's always helpful to see other things. The kmitza by the mincha. Remember what you do? You take the dough, right? You make a mixture of flour with some water and some oil usually, and then you put the frankincense on in some of them. Then you take a kmitza, right? The kohen puts his 3 fingers in. Without that kmitza, you can't burn anything on the altar. So the kmitza is like the sprinkling of the blood. It permits something else. So the kmitza will never have pigul associated with it because it permits something else. But then what does it permit, right? It permits the burning on the altar. That's the part that has mitirim, because without that, you can't burn it on the altar. Okay, so that's why blood will never have pigul associated with it. Okay, new Mishnah. Kol ma'aseh Yom Kippurim ha'amor ala seder. Im ikdim ma'aseh lechavero lo asa klum. All the actions, and we're going to limit this, but right now, it sounds like everything. Everything you do on Yom Kippur has a particular order. We learned all about the order a while back. We've been learning all throughout also the order, what you do when. Everything has a particular order. If you do it out of order, lo asav klum, it's irrelevant what you did. You have to start all over. So, hikdim dam ha'seir ledam ha'pal yachzor. Here's an example. If you, for example, sprinkle the blood in the Kodesh HaKodeshim of the goat before the bull, yachzor v'yazeh midam ha'seir lachar dam ha'pal. Remember, you're supposed to start with the par. You bring the blood inside. Okay, let's go through the whole order. Okay, you slaughter the par. You then do the chafinat aktoret. Remember, you put your hand, the kohen gathers up handfuls of incense. He brings it inside. He burns it inside. He comes back out. He takes the blood. He brings the blood of the bull inside, sprinkles the blood inside, goes back out, slaughters the goat, takes the blood inside, sprinkles it inside, goes out, starts sprinkling the blood of the par and then the blood of the seir on the parochet. Then he goes to the mizbach hazahav and he sprinkles the blood there, right? He does around the 4 corners first. He doesn't sprinkle, he places it. And then he does it on the top of the altar 7 times, sprinkles it. So that's the order, basically. So if you did it out of order, like for example, you did the blood of the goat before you did the blood of the bull. So you have to go back, as you did dam ha'seir, you sprinkled it inside the Kodesh Kodeshim, let's say. You now do the dam ha'pal, but since you did the par after the seir, that's no good. So now you have to sprinkle the seir again. Okay, you have to do a whole new sprinkling of the goat. The im, now some people don't have the letter vav, because really it's a new thing. What we're really discussing here, which is interesting, is mistakes in the temple. Okay, I think this topic is going to be a topic for the next little while, and we've discussed this already. And again, I think this goes back to this concept that we've seen before about that the temple was a place, right? You might think everything's perfect in the temple. You feel like this place of perfection. See the pictures, everything's beautiful. First of all, we already learned it gets pretty dirty there, right? The parochet gets stained. We saw it doesn't have, right? You look in the pictures and everything looks so picture perfect. But really, it was a place, it also looks so pristine. It was full of people, full of commotion. Remember, we talked about all the noise, and it was full of jealousy between Kohanim and everybody wanting a part of things. And it was full of all sorts of, mistakes that were made. Oh, we spilled the blood by accident. You got the blood, Yom Kippur, you did the bull, and then all of a sudden your blood spills all over. What do? So there's a place of human interaction where all of human interaction comes in, both positive and sometimes negative. So, whether it be negative interactions between people or just mistakes. We all make mistakes. So happens. So what happens if you started sprinkling inside the Kodesh Kodashim, and in the middle of sprinkling, let's say the bull's blood, it spills all over the floor. What do? Yavi damachel, you bring new blood. Now, what does this mean? There's a whole new process. You don't just bring new blood. You have to slaughter a new bull. Okay, if it's the goat, we're going to get to this. It's much more complicated because you have to slaughter a new goat. But remember, the goat there were two goats. You put the goral, right? You had a lottery. Which one goes to Lashem? Which one goes to Azazel? You can't just take a new goat. The goat has to go through a lottery process. So you have to start a new lottery process, pick again which goes which. Now you're going to have extra animals around, right? In all these cases, you're going to have extra animals. We're going to have to discuss what happens to all those animals. Okay, that's going to come up soon, which is, what do you do with all the bulls whose blood you spilled? Do they all get burned? What do you do with the Shiur Lazazel? Let's say you have 3 now that got in a lottery that are Shiur Lazazel because you spilled the blood a few times and you had to keep slaughtering new goats. So one got Lashem. So you lost the blood on that one. So now you bring the new one. But now you have 3 goats, for example, that are all designated Lazazel. What are you supposed to do with them, right? And all sorts of interesting questions are going to come up, right? So again, this is all, it's what I like to explain about these things, that this is showing humans in there. It's showing issues that come up in our daily basis, right? Sometimes you think we're talking about such high, lofty things that don't connect to our life. But this is really all about, what do we do when we make mistakes? We all know there's some mistakes we make in our lives that are critical and you have to fix them. And sometimes you do something wrong and you kind of get away with it and it can go without. So these are all kind of issues that are coming up here. So you bring new blood, meaning you slaughter a new animal. Maybe you even have to do a lottery if it's the goat. And you start the sprinklings from the beginning of the Kodesh Kodashim. You have to start from the beginning. Meaning whatever you didn't count. You don't have like half a sprinkling. It doesn't work that way. But what they're going to say is each set of sprinklings, and it's interesting where they break it. I'll tell you why, right? We have the sprinklings inside, we have the sprinklings by the parochet, and then we have the sprinklings on the golden altar. The golden altar really splits into 2 because we have the ones that are the matnot that go around the mizbeach on the 4 corners, and then we have the ones that go on top. Seems from our Mishnah that that's all one unit. Okay, so we have 3 units, and depending on where you spilled the blood, if it's in the middle of, let's say, the 2nd unit, the ones by the parochet, so you don't have to go back and do the ones in the Kodesh Kodashim. You just start from the beginning of that set. Okay, so you start from the ones on the parochet, or if it happened while you were by the golden altar. So you start from the beginning of those, but you don't have to go all the way back to the beginning, and you don't have to do the ones on the parochet. It's very interesting that they say this. You would think this is all one atonement process, but they view, Tanakama views this as each one is a separate process of atonement, and therefore each one is its own unit, so you don't have to go all the way back. They disagree and they say, no, wherever you stop, right? It's interesting. Nobody says you have to go back to the very beginning. Nobody views this as one unit to the extent that you have to start from the very beginning. Let's say you're at the last sprinkling and it spills, you don't have to start from the beginning. But they say you don't even have to go back at all. You don't have to go back to the beginning of the section you were in. You just pick up where you left off. Doesn't matter if it's from a different animal. That's not important. It's blood. You slaughtered it for the sake of this. It doesn't really make any difference. So the Gemara starts off Tanu Rabbanan. Let's go back to the beginning. Kol ma'aseh Yom Kippurim ha'amor al seder. Right, everything that was said was according to its order. If you did it out of order, you didn't do anything. But now we're going to limit this a little bit. It's not really everything he does on Yom Kippur. And now we're going to have to fill in the blank. What is it then? So we're going to have a machloket Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Nechemia, and that's going to take us through to the end of today's daf, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, ematai. When is this situation? Bidvarim hanasim bebigdei lavan mibifnim. By the way, we've seen this already. It's only when he wears the white clothes and he's in the Kodesh Kodashim. In other words, the order is significant inside the Kodesh Kodashim. Outside the Kodesh Kodashim, even if he's wearing the special, remember, he wears Bigdei Lavan, the white clothes that are like the Kohen Gadol, regular Kohen clothes. When he does the special Avodot Yom Kippurim, all the other Avodot he does that day, like the Korban Tamid and the Musafim and all sorts of others, he does wearing Bigdei Zahav, the regular Kohen Gadol clothes. So he limits it to not only the white clothing, but only the white clothing and only actions that he does inside the Kodesh Kodashim. Like, for example, notice what was mentioned in the Mishnah. The Mishnah gave an example of the Shiur and the par's blood being sprinkled in the Kodesh Kodashim. That's your classic example. That has to be done in order. But other things that are done outside the Kodesh Kodashim don't have to be done in order. Again, they have to be done in order, but the ones that are done even in the white Kohen Gadol clothes, outside the Kodesh Kodashim, it's not ideal, but if he did it out of order, it's fine. We don't make him go back. Rabbi Nechemia Omer, he says, no, I don't agree with you. In which case do we say that this is the case? It has to be done in order. He extends this to more cases. He says anything that's unique to Yom Kippur, where the Kohen Gadol wears his white linen clothing, that is all has to be done in its order, right? Beginning from slaughtering the par, to doing the ktoret, to the handful, to bringing it inside, to doing the blood inside, to doing the blood outside, to doing the blood on the altar, right? All those have to be done in order, okay? But things where he's wearing his golden clothes, meaning the everyday things that he does on Yom Kippur or the Musaf, all that, masha sasu, that if it was out of order, it's fine. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan now comes to explain their opinions. They both learned it from the same verse. The first word that's important here is chukah. Chukah means has to be done this way. Okay, it's a rule that you have to keep. And what does it say? Achat b'shana, once a year. So Rabbi Yehuda Savar, what does the once a year come to include and exclude? It's obviously referring to the Kodesh Kodashim, which the Kohen only goes into once a year, Kohen Gadol. And that's the Kodesh Kodashim. So only the Kodesh Kodashim is where we say chukah, it must be done this way. In a minute, we're going to reject this. But right now, that's his reason. Rabbi Nechemia Savar, again, this is Rabbi Yochanan claiming this must be what they hold. It's clothing that he uses to receive atonement once a year. What's that? The unique clothing he wears on Yom Kippur once a year. So it's any time he wears those unique clothes that he wears only once a year. Not location he goes to, but what he's wearing. So the Gemara asks, wait a minute. Atu l'Rabbi Yehuda makom ktiv? The verse never mentioned any mention of location. Seems weird that a chat should be a place where he goes once a year. That really wasn't clear in the verse. And therefore, he gives a different reason now for Rabbi Yehuda. Elahainu tami de Rabbi Yehuda. Ktiv zot uktiv achat. There's two words in that verse which are exclusionary words. Zot, just here, this, right? And achat, one, which means one and not two. So each one is an exclusionary word. So what's it coming to exclude? So according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's excluding two things. What two things? Let's start with the second one first. The obvious one it's excluding is when he's wearing the golden clothes, which is the regular everyday Kohen Gadol clothes. That obviously is excluded. That's one. If you're going to exclude something else, what else would you exclude? What else right? Doesn't necessarily have to be done that way. Well, you must jump up a level. It must be the Bigdei Lavan that he wears when he does actions outside the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh Kodeshim. So that's how he understands. Now we're stuck with Rabbi Nechemia. Rabbi Nechemia thinks that's not what it's coming to limit, because he thinks Bigdei Lavan, even bachutz, even outside, is critical, and it's not excluded from these words that are exclusionary terms. So Rabbi Nechemia says, Chad lemiute Bigdei Zahav. Okay, he agrees with that one. V'chad lemiute shirayim de lo ma'akve. So now it comes out, according to Rabbi Yochanan, there's a big machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia, not just about the Bigdei Lavan, the Bigdei Lavan bifnim or bachutz, whether all those things have to be done in order or not, but also about the remainder of the blood that needs to be spilled in the yesod, which we were just discussing. If you don't do the shirayim, let's say, right, you do the sprinklings of the blood and you do the incense and you do all that, but for whatever reason, the Kohen doesn't, again, we're back to mistakes, he doesn't spill the rest of the blood, the remainder of the blood in the yesod of the mizbeach and the base of the altar outside, right, the outside mizbeach, it's not ma'akev. He says that's what the chukah, achat, and zot. Zot comes to say it's only critical to do in order when we're talking about Bigdei Lavan and not Bigdei Zahav, right? But all Bigdei Lavan, anything he does in Bigdei Lavan. And it's only for the regular blood and all the main activities, but not the shirayim, not the remainder. The remainder in general, there's a whole debate about spilling the remainder in the base of the altar. How important is it, right? Is it just sort of that we're trying to get rid of the blood in a proper manner? Or is it actually really an avodah? Is it part of the ritual? So he says, even if you say it's part of the ritual, it's not a critical element. Okay, if you didn't do it at all, it's okay. So now we end up with this machloket. Like I said, Rabbi Yehuda will say, no, the shirayim are critical. And here's his response to Rabbi Nechemia. He says, Rabbi Yehuda, okay, now he doesn't necessarily say this, but we're putting words in his mouth, according to Rabbi Yochanan, that this is the machloket between them. Rabbi Yehuda will say, ima akve ma'akve, v'lo ma'akve, lo ma'akve. In other words, what's critical is critical. What's not critical is not critical. Why are you drawing the line between shirayim and the rest of the blood? In other words, either the actions he does for Yom Kippur are all critical, which is what you say, right? You said everything's ma'akev that he does in the Bigdei Lavan. Why are you drawing the line between shirayim and not shirayim? Like, I don't get it, right? It's a weird place to draw the line, he says. Either everything is or nothing is. Doesn't make sense. So now, Kidditanya. So again, Rabbi Yehuda will hold putting the blood in the base of the altar is critical. It's just the order doesn't matter. Because again, the order is, I mean, obviously you can't do the remainder before you do the rest of the blood. It's not the remainder if you haven't done the other blood. But in terms of this general principle of things that the order has to be critical, it's only for things done in the Holy of Holies. But in addition, they argue about the issue of the shirayim. So now we're going to say, as it appears in a Braita, and we're going to see, according at least to one understanding of this Braita, that Rabbi Yehuda says that you have to do the shirayim. It's a critical part of the service, as opposed to Rabbi Nechemia, who doesn't appear in this Braita, but he must hold by the other side that it's not critical. So the pasuk here says, "V'chila michaper et hakodesh." Okay, literally it means, and he finishes to atone in the holy place, or the holy something. So now, what do they darshan? They want to use, why did they use this word? And he finishes to atone. Why finishing and atone? Why do they go together? Why is that important? So the first way of darshaning is Rabbi Akiva. He says, the way we read this is, im kipel kila, v'im lo kiper lo kila. If he did what's necessary to achieve atonement, then he's finished. And if he doesn't, then he's not. What does it mean to achieve atonement? We always say, what's the atonement? Atonement is achieved by the pouring of the blood, the sprinkling of the blood, or whatever it might be. In this case, it's sprinkling and the placing of the blood. So basically, if you finish all the blood placements and sprinklings, then you're basically done. It's true there might be some other things, but you're mainly done. What are the other things that are outside of this? Shirayim, right? Because that's not, you achieve atonement before you do the shirayim. Even if you say it's critical, everyone agrees that the atonement is achieved once you finish with the main placings of the blood or sprinklings of the blood, but you don't need to do the shirayim to receive atonement. So he seems to be saying, again, this is going to be one reading of this source, that if you do the sprinklings of the blood, but not necessarily the shirayim, you're basically done. Amar lo Rabbi Yehuda, mipnei ma lo ne'omar, why wouldn't we say it the reverse? You're darshaning this kila michaper. And what did you say? Im kiper kila. But the verse starts off with kila. So why don't you say im kila kiper? V'im lo kila lo kiper. If you finished, then you've received atonement. And if you don't finish, then you haven't received atonement. So one way of understanding this is, what does it mean if you finished? Finished means you did all the parts of the process, including the shirayim, the remainder of the blood that you poured into the base of the altar. So if you finished all that, then you'll receive atonement. If you didn't finish all that, you won't. That shows that he holds that it's ma'akev, and there's our proof for what we just said. That's why we brought this. So she'im chisa. Now, the problem is the Braita says here, though, doesn't say if you didn't do the shirayim. The Braita says she'im chisa echat min hamatanot. If you didn't do one of the placings of the blood, lo asava lo klum. You didn't do anything. But here comes the important part. So they said, what's the difference between them? Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, we don't know who said what. There's machloket between them about this machloket. Chad amar mashma'ut dorshim ika benayu. One says they really are saying one and the same thing. Rabbi Yehuda says you have to finish the sprinklings in order to, right? If you finished all the sprinklings of the blood, not including the shirayim, as I said before, if you finish all the sprinklings of the blood, then you'll receive atonement. And Rabbi Akiva said, if you kipel, if you atone, meaning you finished all the sprinklings of the blood, then you're done. So it means they really say the same thing. There's no difference. It's just a matter of how they read the verse. Is it in kila kiper or in kiper kila? And it really isn't so significant. There's no practical difference. But Chadamal, one said, Shirayim ma'akve ika benayu. One said, no. What Rabbi Yehuda means is what I said before. If you finish, meaning to the very end, including the remainder of the blood poured into the base of the altar, then you'll receive atonement. And if you don't, then you don't. Whereas it's clear, Rabbi Akiva doesn't think that. Rabbi Akiva says, as soon as you received atonement, which is the sprinklings and not the pouring of the remainder, then you're already done, basically. Yeah, you should do it, but if you didn't do it, it's okay. So here we show that according at least to one of them, that Rabbi Yehuda holds Shirayim or Ma'akve, and Rabbi Nechemia will obviously hold not, and that's part of the machloket between them that we saw before. Now, according to this, we showed that according to Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Nechemia holds that the shirayim aren't critical. The problem is that there's a separate source in Zvachim that seems to indicate that Rabbi Nechemia thinks shirayim are critical. Okay, and it's in a different context. But mi amar Rabbi Yochanan hachi? Did Rabbi Yochanan really say this? V'hama Rabbi Yochanan, doesn't Rabbi Yochanan say the following? Tana Rabbi Nechemia kedivrei ha'omer shirayim ma'akve. He said that there's a Braita where Rabbi Nechemia holds, like the one who says shirayim are critical, a critical part. Okay, this machloket comes up in Zvachim. It's, like I said, in a different topic. There's a Mishnah, the Paschals like Rabbi Nechemia, okay, that if you take the blood, you're not allowed to take the blood outside of the temple. Okay, so if you like sprinkle the blood, let's say in an altar outside the temple, it's a problem. Okay, so you can't do any korbanot outside the temple. But there's a debate about, okay, it says ish mi beit Yisrael sheyaleh ola o zevach vel petach ol moed lo yivienu. You bring a korban and you don't bring it to ol moed, to the temple. Lasot yito laHashem v'nichrat ha'isha hu me'amav. Okay, you get karet. Now, they say here, and this goes like Rabbi Nechemia, they say that the right, so Rabbi Yochanan says that the shirayim, one second, how did the shirayim come up here? Right. Rabbi Nechemia in the Mishnah there says that if you took the remainder of the blood, in other words, we would assume that that's referring to the main blood. You take the main blood you were supposed to put on the altar inside and you put it outside, you're going to get karet. Rabbi Nechemia says, even if you did that with the remainder of the blood outside the temple, you're going to get karet. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan explains that must mean that Rabbi Nechemia holds that shirayim are critical. Otherwise, if they're not critical, you wouldn't be obligated for sacrificing them outside the temple. And therefore, there seems to be a problem here because Rabbi Nechemia, according to Rabbi Yochanan in our sugya, he thinks Rabbi Nechemia holds shirayim are not critical. And in that source, he seemed to say that Rabbi Nechemia holds shirayim are critical. To which the Gemara answers, kasha. It doesn't really answer. It says this is in fact difficult. So we have a difficulty to what we just built about the fact that there's this difference between Rabbi Nechemia and Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rabbi Yochanan, about is it shirayim ma'akve or not? Are they essential? Are they not? According to Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Nechemia thinks they're not essential, but in Zvachim, he seems to say that Rabbi Nechemia thinks they are essential, in which case we have a bit of a problem. And they're left with the problem, they don't explain it. Last thing for today. Amar Rabbi Chanina, Ktoret shechafna kodem shlitato shel par lo asa velo klum. Okay, let's go back to the order. Slaughter the bull. take the handful of incense, bring it into the temple, burn it, then sprinkle the blood of the bull inside. So what if you did the chafina, you did the handful of the incense before slaughtering the bull? Now, that's a case of bigdei lavan b'chutz, right? So what would Rabbi Yehuda say about this? It's fine, because he only thinks bigdei lavan bifnim. So therefore, the Gemara says, it says in the, Rabbi Chanina says, the ketoret that you did out of order before you slaughtered the bull, lo asava lo klum. It's as if you did nothing, you have to start from the beginning. Kiman, right? Because we're all talking about taking the handful. We're not talking about burning it inside. We're talking about taking the handful itself. Kiman de lo ke Rabbi Yehuda. This sounds like it's not like Rabbi Yehuda because he thinks only things inside. To which we now change Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, but first we're going to say why it's not Rabbi Yehuda. Di Rabbi Yehuda ha'amal. Didn't Rabbi Yehuda say ki ktiva chuka b'dvarim anasim b'bigdei lavan mibifnim u'dichtiva? And this is not inside the Kodesh Kodashim. Where do you do the chafinat haktoret? Right, you do it outside. So therefore, it's not Rabbi Yehuda. And now the Gemara says, no, maybe you can explain Rabbi Yehuda a little differently. Maybe we can widen Rabbi Yehuda, the scope of what he says. We thought he meant only like the blood of the par and the blood of the seir that you're sprinkling inside, and you do those two things out of order. Or let's say you sprinkle the blood of the bull before you burn the incense inside. But we say here, no, afilu tema Rabbi Yehuda, sorech pnim kipnim dami. These are things, slaughtering the bull, doing the chafina of the ketoret, that are necessary in order to do things inside. As opposed to, let's say, when you sprinkle the blood on the parochet, you don't need to do that to do something inside. But to slaughter the bull and to do the handful of incense, that's preparing you for going inside. So maybe even Rabbi Yehuda will agree, it's not just things done inside, but anything done to prep for going inside. To which the Gemara says, but wait a minute, right? So then he's going to say, Tanan, it says in our Mishnah though, if you haven't finished inside and the blood gets spilled, what did we say? Right? You have to slaughter a new animal, which didn't really say, but it obviously meant slaughter a new animal and bring new blood to the temple. Now, if you do that, what's going to happen? You're going to slaughter the bull when? After you did the incense, because the incense was done. First, you slaughtered the bull. Then you did the chafina. Then you did the incense inside. Then you start sprinkling the blood, you spilled the blood, you have to start from slaughtering a bull again. And now if you slaughter the bull, you're going to have to do the incense after the slaughtering of the bull. And notice, im ita, if it was really true that it's not ma'akev, that it's ma'akev, im ita yachzor v'yachfon mebayale, it should have said, you have to go back and redo the incense. And it doesn't say that. So therefore, it's hard to say that Rabbi Yehuda thinks that the only way to explain this is, well, that's not an activity done outside and therefore done inside, and therefore it's not ma'akev, and that goes to Rabbi Yehuda. And the fact that this is preparation for inside is not relevant. So that seems to go against what we just said, to which the Gemara answers very simply, b'ketoret lo kamayre. The topic of the Mishnah wasn't the ketoret. Obviously, you'd also have to do the ketoret again because now everything's out of order. But you just don't, they just didn't mention it because that wasn't the focus of the Mishnah, just like they didn't say you have to slaughter a bull again, right? They didn't talk about that, but it's obvious that you would have to do that all over again if you want to say that Rabbi Yehuda holds that even things done outside, if they're preparation for inside, they would have to be done in their exact order. And with that, we'll end for today with, again, a lot of thoughts about messing up, what happens if you mess up, and we're going to see lots more of this in the coming dapim. Chodesh Tov, everybody, and have a great day.